In the last video, we talked about Blender's node editor, one of Blender's 17 different editor types. It is the editor that we use to edit materials for objects in cycles, as well as edit compositing effects. That's kind of like Photoshop type stuff that we can put on top of our final rendered image, as well as materials for our background, our environment, the sky, stuff like that. So I am in Blender Render right now, but I'm going to go ahead and switch this to Cycles Render. And you'll see when I do that, now down here I have the option for either creating materials for objects, which is what this little highlighted yellow cube means, or creating cycles materials for the background world environment, which is what the little world is for. So I'll switch that back to object. So right now, if I were to press new, go ahead and give this object a new material here, and you can see it show up here in the material tab of the properties panel over here. If I were to either press Shift A, or I could double right click to bring up my add menu. You can also get access to adding these different node types via the tool shelf. If you press T in the node editor, you will see all the different node options such as input, output, shader, etc. These are all the same options in the add menu, but I typically find it easiest just to double right click to bring up the add menu the same way I do in the 3D view. So I'll go ahead and press T and shut those. So if we take a look at this add menu, double right click here, we'll find all the available node types to add. So what I want to do is real quickly go over what each of these offer, but for the bulk of this video, we're going to be focusing on shader nodes. Shader nodes are really the next to last gatekeepers of what your final material will be. So you've got all these different other node types, and usually those are funneling into these shader types, and then finally these shader types run to the material output, which is the gatekeeper of the material, if that makes any sense. In other words, everything has to funnel to one of these three output options when you're dealing with cycles materials for objects. The shader nodes are really your base options for the way everything else will be affecting your material. Very similar to your material options when in Blender Render mode. So for instance, if I were to switch this from cycles back to Blender Render, and I'll switch this back to the 3D view, and I'll just double right click over here and add some random object, and I'll press new while in Blender Render here. We have all these diffuse options. That's sort of the basic color of the material. We have mirror, which deals with reflectivity, stuff like that. Transparency options, where we can adjust those things. And if I were to press Alt-Z to switch the viewport from solid viewport shading to material, or I could just use this menu, of course, you can see the effects of that transparency and so on. Things like specularity, and so on. And in a previous video, when we were covering Blender Render materials, we learned there's a really strong relationship between these material options here, which you can think of these as your shader options for Blender Render, and the textures we use in conjunction with the Blender Render materials. But the main thing I want to get across is that your shader options are really your starting ground for what you're going to create, the kind of effects you're going to get on your materials. And so that's why we want to discuss those first when dealing with cycles materials. So I'm going to go ahead and press X to delete that because we won't be needing that. And I'm going to make sure this cube is selected here, switch this back to cycles render, and switch this back to the node editor. Okay, so we want to get a feel for these shader nodes here, but real quickly before that, let's discuss what these other node types do. Now, I'm not going to get into each node for these node types. I just want you to have a basic understanding of what these are before we start talking about these individual shader nodes. First in the menu, we have search. So if you're semi-familiar with something and you know it exists, but you can't find it, you can always use this and say search for a glossy node or something like that. Then we have input. This set of nodes is all about gathering information from outside of the material, whether that's on the object itself, from an attribute of the object, from the direction a camera is pointing, particle info, etc. These input nodes are all about gathering information from other stuff going on in the scene to help the material figure out how to look or position itself or do different things. Output nodes, this is a very short list here because these are basically just nodes that everything will funnel into. So your options are either material output or lamp output. So we've got the material output here already, and like I said before, all the other nodes will have to funnel to this material output for their effects to show up. And then the other option is just lamp output, and that's if you're making a material for a lamp. So say you've got some like weird textures or stuff you want to affect the light that you're emitting from a lamp. Then of course shader, we talked about. This is similar to the list of options that show up by default on your Blender render materials when you're in the material tab of the properties panel. In fact, you actually can get access to those shader nodes much in a similar way you have default access to them when you're dealing with Blender render materials once you've added them in the node editor. So for instance, we've got this diffuse node here, and if we click under surface, we have access to all the options and sliders on that node. So you can actually build all this cool stuff up in the node editor and then have a nice organized way to control these sliders and options, much in a similar way you control materials in the Blender render engine. So it makes sense that the shader node settings that you add, whatever you've got added to your particular material in the node editor, will show up here where your basic stuff like transparency, specularity, mirror, and stuff like that are for Blender render materials. Texture nodes, in the same way that when we're dealing with a Blender render material, we have access to the textures that are housed inside of that material right here on the properties panel. We can create new textures for our materials via this texture menu here in the node editor. So in terms of really getting a foundational understanding of Cycles materials, your first two objectives really are getting a basic grounding in these shader nodes and these texture nodes. And then basically the rest of these node categories are things that manipulate your shader nodes and your texture nodes. And as we discussed in the video on Blender render textures, a lot of times people get into the habit of thinking of a texture as just an annoying thing standing between getting an image onto your material, such as when you are putting a logo on a soda can or something like that. But in reality, procedural textures or math pattern generated textures give us a huge artistic range of awesome things we can do with our materials. So we'll be getting into texture nodes in an upcoming video. Color option, this lets us control nodes focused on color. Obviously, things like curves, hue, saturation, gamma, bright contrast, kind of, if you're familiar with Photoshop, a lot of that kind of stuff. So just standard fare there. And all of these color nodes can be used to do really cool things, but a really important one is this Mix RGB node, which allows us to merge two sets of color information together in a similar way that we can use this mix shader node to merge different shader effects. We'll get into what all that means in a minute, but just keep an eye on that mix RGB as well as the mix shader, because a lot of the power of Cycles materials will be found in mixing things. Vector options, this lets us plug in similar information to some of the things we can get from these input nodes about information either about our objects, such as the faces or normals on the object, or other scene information. These vector nodes give us access to similar stuff, but mostly concerning bump mapping and normal mapping, which is, of course, a sort of lighting trick, increasing the detail on our objects, and we'll get into that. And then under Converter, we have Math. So this Math node is really commonly used. It's basically a dial that we can use to increase or decrease the different effects of different nodes. So the title of this pretty much gives this away. So there's nodes to like convert RGB, which is any type of colored effect, into black and white, which this is often used to produce images into effect controls, but I'll get into what that means in the future. Scripts, which can be used for additional control over materials if you know how to use them. And group options allow us to either make groups of nodes or ungroup them, as we talked a little bit about in the last video. So say I had a bunch of nodes over here, and I'll just press D to duplicate all these diffuse nodes. Of course, there'd be no point in having all these, but say I were to select these by clicking and dragging my mouse down, and I could bring up the menu and either press Ctrl G or just press Make Group here. This will send all the nodes I had selected into a new group. I can use this little button down here to get out of this group and back into the main node editor area, or I can always just click this little button here on the new node group I created to get back into that group if I want to edit stuff in that group. So I'll click that to get back there. And then under layout, we have some really sweet options for helping us stay organized when our node setups get a little nuts. And if you've ever searched Cycles materials on Google image search, you'll absolutely know how insane some of these node setups can get, which is not always a good thing, which is usually, in my experience, a bad thing. So we have this frame option here, which I could set here. And this will automatically expand and contract to allow you to enter sets of nodes. And this is just a really nice organization tool. Of course, if you have that node selected, you could press T to bring up the tool shelf. And over here in the properties, you could rename the label, which nodes have a name. And basically the name is for internal code use and stuff like that. And then they have a label, and that's what will actually show up on them. So if we were to change the label of this layout node here, we could call this my nodes, I guess. That's really bad, but anyway, you get the basic idea. And I'll go ahead and close all these up and press T to dismiss my tools here. That's a basic rundown of what these node categories are all about. We'll be learning more about these as we go along, but for now, we're going to focus on these shader nodes. Because there's quite a few of these shader nodes, what I'm going to do is stop the camera for a second, and I'm going to lay out every one of these nodes in sort of a pyramid so we can take a look at the different types of shader nodes here. What are the more common used ones? What are the ones you'll need on a daily basis as opposed to ones you might use every now and then, and that sort of thing. So be back in a sec. Okay, so we're back. I'm going to go ahead and press my tilde key to go into full screen here so we can get a better look at everything going on. Well, here we have laid before us is a little pyramid of all the different shader node types. So if I were to double right click under the shader menu of nodes, this is all of these nodes. So the first three I've got up here are this mix shader, this add shader, and this holdout. And the reason why these are at the top is that these shader nodes aren't things that directly affect your material, as they are a sort of funneling systems for the nodes that actually do stuff to your material. So this mix shader is for combining the effects of two other of these different shader types. Any of these two you can find here can go into here, and you can control which node going into each of these shader sockets here gets the most of the effect by controlling this factor value here. So if I were to pull this all the way to the left, whatever was connected into this shader would be on 100%. And whatever was going into this shader socket here would not show up at all. And if I were to drag this all the way to the right, vice versa for these. Then you have this add shader, which is basically the same thing as this, only it just fully combines whatever two nodes you have plugged into here and does not give you the option of controlling which node going in there will have the most effect or not. Then you have this holdout node, which basically allows you to put a mask over an object or whatever objects happen to be using that material, and cause it to knock out everything that would be behind it, which if you're using transparent renders, then you'll be able to use an alpha channel or a transparent channel behind this, but if not, this will just make everything look black. So if you're using this with any materials, you always want to make sure, I'll press tilde key to get out of full screen for a second, that if you're using the holdout node, you want to make sure use transparent is turned on here down in the director's share options menu. Okay, I'll press tilde key to get back into full screen here. Next, we have what I really consider to be the bread and butter of the shader node set. Of course, some of this is subjective depending on what kind of stuff you normally like to make. I'm sure that there's people who would wildly disagree with me here about this hierarchy, but I wanted to at least present some kind of hierarchy to new users to help create some mental breathing room in dealing with this big list here. So these 5 shader nodes, diffuse, glossy, transparent, glass, and emission, are nodes that you'll be able to plug into under output. I put a material output here. These are nodes you'll be able to plug into your material output and immediately see what these things do. Whereas a lot of these other nodes down here, you need a little bit more understanding about nodes in general to create some more fine-tuned effects when you're fine-tuning your material. So to show you what I mean here, I'm going to press tilde key to get back out of full screen here, and I've got my camera focused in on our cube with this generic material where we've added all these nodes here. And of course the cube is black right now because there's actually nothing connecting to this material output. And like I mentioned before, the material output is the node that everything else has to flow into one of these three options here for the material to be seen at all. So we've got diffuse, which gives us basic control of the color of our object. So I could connect this green socket here to this green surface socket. And as we mentioned, not in all cases, but most of the time, if sockets can be connected, they will be the same color. So we've got this green BSDF out, which is what we call the sockets on the right side of a node. We've got this out to this surface in, which an in socket is what we call the sockets to the left of the node. Actually, the way this is positioned, this looks like this might be running through some of this other stuff, but it's not. So I could just go ahead and move this to make sure that's not confusing there. And of course, we can click on this color value and change this to whatever we want. So now if I were to press my render preview button down here, we can see what this would look like if it were actually going to render. Now right now this looks really flat because by default we just have this basic solid white background, which is producing a basic ambient light for our cycles environment. But if we wanted to pause the render preview and under lights, turn on quick lights feature here, which what this does is you can see when I did that, this new object pops up here in my outliner. And if I click the plus sign under it, there's 3 additional objects parented to it. And this is just a simple light setup to make it easier to, well, specifically for ZeroBrush when you're painting in cycles, but also when you're just working with materials and things, it's really a nice, quick, simple lighting setup for testing out materials and stuff. Notice that the background went black and that we can't actually see these objects that will be producing the light. That's because they are hidden until we either render or do a render preview here. So I could press my render preview button. Notice now that there's a lot more definition in this cube, and that's because we actually have this lighting set up. You can't see the actual light sources of the ZeroBrush quick lights, and that's by design because you don't want to be able to see big white circles hovering around everywhere. You just want to be able to see the effects of those light. But if I were to switch this back to the 3D view, while we're doing a render preview here, we will see these active in the scene if we're in a 3D viewport that's not doing a render preview. So you can see the actual objects that are generating the light, one up top. And then if I back out here, 3 big other lights here, which are pretty sweet. So I'll go ahead and switch this back to the node editor. We've got this basic diffuse node funneling into this surface of the material output, and that lets us control this color here. So I'll go ahead and turn that off there. So to make the testing of these other 4 a little more interesting, let's head back to the 3D view. Let's tap W, let's say about 4 times to give this cube some smoothing. Press tab to go into edit mode, select one of these faces. I'm going to press E to extrude. It doesn't really matter what you do to this thing. We just want to give it some more curves and have it doing some weird stuff so we've got a more interesting object to look at for the materials. So I'll press E to extrude again, S to scale, E to extrude down, E to extrude again. And I'm just scaling and extruding, you know, sometimes extruding down, sometimes extruding up, you know, just to have something weird here for us to look at. All right, that'll do. And let's go ahead and add some other stuff around here so we can see better the effects of some of the shaders. So I'll press Shift A and under Mesh, add a plane. I've got my 3D cursor down there in the center. If yours wasn't, you could just press Shift C and that'll of course recenter your view and set the 3D cursor back to the center. Let's scale this up here and maybe also add a Suzanne head. And I made this thing so big that the Suzanne head spawned inside of it and we can't even see it. So I had to press Z to go into wireframe so I could get that out of there. And this doesn't have to be, you know, perfect or fancy. We just want a few things lying around to maybe reflect onto this object we're working with its material. Okay, that'll be fine. So let's click back onto the object where we have this basic cycles material here and switch this back to the node editor. In the next video, we're going to be discussing all of these shader nodes and how to use them. But for now, we're not going to get too deep into these sliders and things like that. I just want to show you the immediate joy that can be gained from using these 5 basic shader types. Once again, these are found under the shader category of nodes in the node editor to add those. And so we've got the diffuse, which controls, you know, the basic color, which we can adjust here. But let's go ahead and press X to delete that. and you'll see our material goes black again because there's nothing connecting to the head master output there. And I'll just select this glossy and I'll drag it over here. And I'll go ahead and click on the output socket of the glossy and connect it back to the surface. So now we've got the glossy node, and if we press our render preview button, we can immediately see what this does to this. This creates a super reflective, awesome, chromy looking surface, which, as we'll learn about in the future, there's a million different ways to connect textures and other nodes and blend things into getting amazing effects for all sorts of stuff. Immediately, though, we have this roughness value, which the lower we make this, the shinier it will get. And so when we bring it all the way down to 0, it's pretty much just a mirror. And as you can see, when I lower the camera down here, we've got these Suzanne heads reflecting directly into our weird object thing. And we can increase this roughness value to make it not so reflective and kind of blend that gloss effect there. Okay, so next in line we have the transparent node. So I'm going to go ahead and just, with this glossy selected, press X to delete it, click on this transparent, and just grab it over here. And so right now, if I connect this transparent socket to the surface socket of the material output, we'll see that going from black to back to white again, because if there's no node connected to the surface, it's just totally black. And so now if we press the render preview button, lo and behold, the object has done a disappearing act and totally vanished. So if we don't have any other nodes being used besides this transparent node, it will just make the object entirely invisible. So to get any sort of effect beyond that, we're going to need to mix this node with something else. So I will turn off my render preview there. And what I can do is just click on this mix shader here, and I'll press D to go ahead and duplicate it. And notice that if I drag this over this link, which the lines connecting the sockets of the nodes is officially called a link there. So notice if I drag this over this link, it highlights. And that means that I can let it go and it will automatically connect its input socket out through its output socket to whatever is on the other side, basically. So I could press G to grab or just click and drag it over. And if I drop it here, notice it automatically completes the circuit here by letting this link connect to its input shader out to its output shader there. Notice also that it automatically repositioned everything over. This is really useful when you're working really loose with stuff and you're not too worried about staying organized. You just need for stuff to not overlap. But if you're trying to be more organized than that, you can press this button to disable that feature and then just drop it and it won't move anything. So I could press Ctrl Z to undo that, then turn this button off, then press G to grab, drop it on top of here. And now these are connected still the same, but it didn't move everything over. So I'll go ahead and lift that transparent up and drop this mix shader down here so we can see what's going on. Notice that even though we have stuff connected to this surface output, that this object is now black. So it's acting like nothing is connected to it at all. And the reason why that is because this factor value, that's what the FAC stands for, of this mix shader, is pulled all the way over to the right. And of course, when this value is all the way up to here, it's giving total control to whatever is or isn't plugged into this shader socket down here. So because there's no node connected to this and full power is turned on for that node, it's as though there is no node connected to the surface, and that's why it's black right now. But if we were to pull this all the way down to 0, it gives total control to this socket, which is connected to the transparent node there. And so if we were to press render preview again or do an actual render, actually render our scene out, the object would look totally invisible. So to get it to not look invisible, what we're going to need to do is mix it with another node by connecting it to this other shader spot of this mix shader. So we could use any of these and combine these effects, but just for simplicity's sake, let's go ahead and add another diffuse here. And I'll just connect this green to this green because typically the color-coded stuff means we can connect it. Now, even though this is connected, if I press render preview, it'll still look invisible. And why? Because the factor value is still at 0 here, giving all the control to this node here, the transparency node. But if we bring this up to about half or so, we'll get half diffuse, which is basic color node, so we can make this anything, and then half transparency. So if I press render preview now, we get this kind of transparent pink color mixing this transparency and this diffuse. Also, whenever you have this transparent node mixed with something else, you'll actually be able to use this color value, which otherwise wouldn't matter because it's totally making everything invisible. But now, because it's only half making things invisible, we could set this to something else, and notice that that green is now playing into the final output of this surface here. What we end up doing a lot of times is usually not so much just using these solid colors here with these nodes, but a lot of times we will use texture nodes to output images from PNGs, JPEGs, whatever, or use procedural textures, math-generated patterns and stuff that we learn can do amazing things into these color values, which give us even more crazy effects. And in a video coming up soon, we're going to be discussing these texture nodes. But for instance, I could select this noise texture here and plug this color value into this diffuse node, which is the basic color. So now if we press render preview, we'll see the effects of this noise texture showing up on the diffuse half of this little setup here. All right, so moving on, let's go ahead and shift select all these, press X to delete all those, and let's bring this glass node up here. So if I go ahead and connect the glass output to the surface input and press render preview, that's pretty much all I have to do, and I have some amazing looking glass here. So it's transparent, it's got the reflections of glass, it's bending light in accordance to the way this mesh is shaped, so it's really cool. We have control over the index of refraction value, which controls the angle of which the light will bend. I tend to think of this as basically control of the thickness of the glass, which of course the actual thickness of glass would control the index of refraction, so that makes sense, but we can get different results when we play with that. And roughness, we can use very similarly to the glossy node to control the reflectivity part of this glass shader here. So we can make it, a bit more frosty, or maybe you're looking for an older, worn out glass effect. You can get that by doing that. And finally, I'll go ahead and turn that off and press X to delete that. Let's grab this emission node, and I'm going to just pull it over here and plug it into the surface. And notice that all of these so far, we've just used the surface value of the material output. We're going to get into using the volume and displacement, which lets us do normal map, bumping, type, cool, fake 3D effects stuff. And we're going to be using all of these nodes in the next video, but we just want to discuss these basic 5 first. Emission is just light. It just turns our object into a light emitting thing. So if I press render preview now, notice that this is now a glowing light, casting this white light, which we can control the color here, onto everything. So if I were to go under lights, turn the scene brightness value all the way down to 0, and press render preview, we'll see just the light being emitted off our weird little, alien vase, whatever it is we made. We can control the strength of it, like this. We can change its color, which is real cool. And of course, we could plug other nodes into this color value or strength value to get all sort of crazy effects. There's a lot of super fun stuff we can do, so I'm really excited to get to that in the next video. So thanks for watching, and stay tuned for more.